So, in previous lectures, we've talked about how water and how minerals that are dissolved in water and how sugars, which are the product of photosynthesis, how they move through plants as far as what structures they move through, right? So, when we talked about vascular tissue in roots and stems and leaves, what we were talking about is we were talking about the xylem and the phloem, right? So again, refer back to your notes and previous lectures about the structure of xylem, the structure of phloem, and what materials they carry. What we're going to look at in today's lecture is how that material actually moves. Now, in a human, material moves through our body using our circulatory system, right? So we have blood and we have red blood cells in our blood that carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have plasma in our blood that carries dissolved minerals and nutrients and waste products. Okay. And we have a heart, a central pump that actually applies pressure to the blood and it pumps the blood through blood vessels, right? So we're not relying on gravity, we're not relying on anything like that in order to move that blood. We actually have a central pump that our body puts a tremendous amount of energy into to actually squeeze that blood around our body. Now, plants do not have a heart. Plants don't have a pump that pumps fluid through the vascular tissue like we do. Okay, so how take a look outside the window here in my classroom. There's a huge spruce tree outside my window. It's I don't know 50 feet tall, right? Some of the largest trees in the world are hundreds of feet tall. How does water make it from the roots to the very tips of those humongous trees if there's no pump, right? And that's a mystery that scientists have been struggling with. And to be 100% honest, scientists don't know 100% how this works, but they do have a bit of an idea. So I mentioned previously that some people will spray their plants, right? I've seen on TV, and I've actually had friends who they walk around with a little spritzer bottle and they spritz their plants, right? Because they think they're watering their plants by wetting the leaves. Now we know, hopefully, I dispelled that myth that that's not true. That might prevent some water loss. It might kind of clean the dust off the plants a little bit, but plants do not absorb water through their leaves, right? We know that plants absorb water through their roots. So how once the water is absorbed through their roots, how does it go up to the leaves where photosynthesis is occurring, and how does it carry nutrients throughout the entire plant? Now, on the other hand, as we discussed in the last lecture, sugars are made in photosynthesis. That occurs mainly in the leaves, and the roots and the stem, they store sugars. So how do those sugars make it downward? Okay, through the phloem down to the stems and the roots. Now, before we kind of look at one of the mechanisms that scientists believe are responsible for this movement, again, we're going to revisit water. I think we've done this like 5 times in this class throughout the semester. Remember, you guys, water is a polar molecule. And what that means is there's a positive end to it and there is a slightly negative end to it. And because an individual water molecule has this polarity, what that means is other water molecules are attracted, right? So I'll just draw it one more time. We talked about this many times before. So I have my slightly negative oxygen end of the water. I have my slightly positive hydrogen end of the water. And what happens is this sets up an attraction between water molecules, right? So water molecules will orient themselves so that the hydrogen and oxygen ends are attracted to one another. Okay. And this is known as cohesion. So essentially, water molecules kind of, like if you put 2 paper clips together to start making a paperclip chain, right? That's kind of what water molecules do. They join each other almost like arm in arm, right? Like they're attracted to one another, and that creates this force. So if one water molecule moves, it tends to drag other water molecules with it. Okay, and that's called cohesion. Now, adhesion, on the other hand, adhesion is is the property of water where water likes to stick to other things as well. Okay, so cohesion is the force between water molecules. And again, this has to do with the opposite charges. And this sets up something known as a hydrogen bond. So this bond is called a hydrogen bond. That's between water molecules. Now, water molecules also like to stick to other things, and this is called adhesion. So if you've ever seen a raindrop on a windshield or on your window, right? That raindrop just kind of sticks there. Now, why does that raindrop stick there? It's because of adhesion. So the water molecules are attracted to each other, but they're also attracted to the glass or to whatever. If you've ever walked through long grass with pants, right? And it's wet, the grass might come up to your ankles, but it seems like, especially if you're wearing like jeans, like something made of cotton that wicks moisture, it seems like when you pass through that grass, you're wet up to your knee, right? Even though the pants haven't come in contact with anything. That's adhesion. Okay, water will travel up because it's attracted to those surfaces. Okay. Now, remember, water travels through xylem in plants. So just like water will stick to your jeans and move up your jeans and make your legs wet when you're walking through wet grass, water will also stick to the walls of the xylem and move up the xylem just like the water moves up the cotton in your jeans. So we've got a few things happening in a plant that helps to pull this water up from the roots up to the plant, up to the tip of the plant. So what we have is something known as a transpiration pull. Do you guys remember I mentioned this the other day? Anybody remember what transpiration is? Transpiration is special evaporation from the leaves of plants. Okay, so it's essentially evaporation. I think everybody knows what evaporation is, but transpiration is evaporation from leaves. Remember, when stomata are open, not only does carbon dioxide enter the plant and oxygen leave the plant, but water also leaves the plant. Okay, and that's known as transpiration. So water molecules are leaving the plant. Okay, so water molecules are leaving the plant through transpiration. Now remember, just like a paperclip chain, water molecules are linked to other water molecules. So when one water molecule leaves through the stomata, it has a tendency to drag other water molecules with it. And they're linked, not just, two water molecules, they're linked in a big long chain all the way down the xylem. So as one water molecule leaves, it all the other water molecules shuffle up the xylem, right? And they're attracted to each other, but they're also attracted to the walls of the xylem. So this is known as transpiration pull. Okay, so transpiration pull is when one water molecule leaves the leaf through transpiration and it pulls other water molecules along with it, all the way from the roots. Okay? Now, this is thought to be the primary force responsible for causing water molecules to travel from roots to leaves. Okay, so this transpiration pull is thought to be the primary way that water is pulled from the roots up the stem, through the vascular tissue, through the xylem, up into the leaves, and then out the stomata. And this relies on cohesion and adhesion properties of water.
So we know all about the xylem and the phloem. But now we need to know exactly how water and minerals move around the plant. Transpiration is the evaporation of water from the aerial parts of the plant, so the leaves and stems. By water evaporating out of these parts, mostly the leaves, a suction pressure is created which draws up the water through the plant. This is called the transpiration pull. But what exactly happens in transpiration? Let's start at the roots. Roots have root hairs, giving them a large surface area for water absorption. Water passes in from the soil by osmosis, passing down the concentration gradient and into the root hair cell's cytoplasm, and then onto the xylem vessels. Water moves through the xylem vessels from the root to the stem to the leaf. Transpiration at the leaf causes a transpiration pull, and because water molecules are cohesive, water is pulled up through the plant in the transpiration stream. As well as the leaf cells needing water for photosynthesis, water also keeps the cells turgid, which supports the plant. Inside the leaves, water is drawn out of the xylem cells to replace the water lost through transpiration. Because of the cohesive nature of water, which also pulls the water through the plant, as water leaves the xylem and moves into the leaf, it again pulls more water molecules behind it. But it isn't just about water. The transpiration stream also transports mineral ions that are dissolved in the water from the roots to the leaves. The transpiration rate isn't constant. There are many different factors that affect it. The environmental factors are similar to those that make you sweaty. The temperature, the humidity, but also wind and light intensity. Then there are also physical factors, like does it have a waxy cuticle? How many stomata does it have? The nature of the guard cells, how large is the leaf surface area, and if the leaf is folded or flat. If the rate of transpiration increases, then the rate of water absorption by the roots needs to increase too. When water is scarce, or if the roots are damaged, the plant needs to reduce its transpiration rate by closing some of their stomata. There are guard cells on either side of the stomata, which regulate this. During daylight hours, chloroplasts produce sugar. This lowers the water potential of the guard cells, and they take in water by osmosis. This makes the guard cells turgid. Because the guard cells have a different cell wall thickness, when turgid, they bend more on the outside into sausage shapes. This opens the stomata, or the pore. Water can then be lost. During the night, all the sugar produced by the chloroplasts gets used up, so the water potential of the guard cells increases. More water, less sugar. The guard cells lose water by osmosis and become flaccid, and the stomata starts to close. This reduces water loss.
So lots of mechanisms at play there. Again, environmental conditions determine how much water is lost by the plant. Plants that live in drier environments are more well adapted to prevent water loss. So they have much smaller leaves, right? You think about a cactus actually doesn't even have leaves. Like the leaves of a cactus have evolved into spikes, right, to protect the actual stem of the cactus. So because they live in such hot and sunny conditions, photosynthesis isn't a problem for them. And then you get into other conditions like in some of our old growth forests at the bottom where there's not a lot of light, the trees have evolved very large leaves. But again, the larger the surface area, the more loss of water they have. So they have to regulate it using cuticles and less stomata per square centimeter and all that sort of thing. So plants are actually pretty fascinating. We don't give them a lot of thought. We just kind of go about our business, and we're thankful for the oxygen they produce and the food they produce. But they're pretty marvelous creatures. Well, they are living things, right? So a good example of seeing this transpiration pull is a classic experiment. Some of you might have done this in elementary school, where you take a piece of celery and you cut it and you put it in some water with some food coloring. And what you'll see after a little while is you'll see that food coloring moves up the celery stalk into the leaves of the celery. So this only works if you leave the leaves intact. Okay, you can't cut those off as well because that's where the surface area is, that's where the stomata are, and that's where your transpiration pull is. So you'll see without the aid of any kind of pump at all, what's happening is the water is evaporating out here, right? The water is evaporating or through transpiration, and it's pulling other water molecules up the xylem. And you can actually see the xylem right here. Okay, so that's the vascular tissue of the celery. And it's highlighted with the food coloring as the food coloring moves up there, right? And you can see that the food coloring eventually makes it up to the leaves. So this shows you that transpiration pull is occurring, and it's pulling those water molecules and anything dissolved in those water molecules up to the leaves. Okay? Now, in addition to transpiration pull, there's a secondary mechanism involved here as well, and it's called root pressure. So roots take in water through osmosis, and anything that's dissolved in that water will also make it into the plant. The plant also has mechanisms in its roots to actively transport in minerals into the plant that the plant needs to make new tissue. So, for example, plants need nitrogen, very important. There's nitrates and nitrites that are dissolved in the soil. Plants need phosphorus. Plants need iron, plants need magnesium, plants need all sorts of different minerals, and the plant will absorb those through osmosis, through absorbing water, and these things are dissolved in water. But also the plant will actively transport this stuff into the root as well, and that will draw more water in. So what happens is you have water, okay, in the soil, and the water is being drawn into the root through osmosis. Okay, that generates a push. There's a pressure there. So water molecule is being pushed into the roots, and water is leaving through the leaves. This is a pull, right? Transpiration pull. This is a push through root pressure. So we have water being pushed in the bottom and pulled out the top, and this allows water to travel from roots to leaves, okay, through the xylem. Okay, so there's a number of forces at play here. And again, scientists don't fully understand this. Some scientists don't think this is enough pressure to actually get this water up to the top of these really huge trees. So they think there's something else at play. But right now, this is kind of the prevailing theory. And I don't use the word theory as a guess. There is scientific evidence that this occurs. But there are scientists that are still examining this today. That's how science works, right? So right now, the prevailing theory is that root pressure, along with transpiration pull and the nature of water itself, the cohesion and adhesion properties of water, help to drive water through the xylem from the roots out through the leaves. Now, I mentioned that hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic is really important. It's important in our bodies, right? We have to maintain balance in our blood and our body tissues. Otherwise, our water balance gets thrown off, and this can cause all sorts of issues with dehydration and with blood pressure and exchange, et cetera, et cetera. Plants, it's really important as well. Because remember, we need water to move into plants. And if water does not move into plants, then plants cannot do photosynthesis. Their central vacuoles, that big container that most plant cells have that stores water, it will shrink. That causes the cell to shrink, right? That's called flaccid. Okay, turgid is when the vacuoles are filled with water and the cell is rigid. That's called turgid. When the cell loses water and it becomes all shriveled, that's called flaccid. So if water is not moving into the plant, then water will move out of the plant, okay? And that can cause wilting. So this celery right here is wilted, right? Why is that? Well, because the celery has lost a lot of its water. Okay, and this is what the cells look like when they are flaccid. Now, this can occur if there's not enough water, number one. Number two, if you water your plants or if the plants are exposed to water that is hypertonic, then this can cause a problem. In Canada here, in Alberta, obviously you guys very well know this, our winters are very harsh. We get a lot of snow, we get a lot of ice, and we put salt on our roads, okay? Now that salt gets splashed onto our boulevards, the graders come along and push it onto our boulevards, and even at home, you guys, your parents might use if we get a rainstorm during the winter or it gets really icy, you put that stuff on your sidewalk, right? A few years ago, my wife bought some stuff. So a friend was doing a fundraiser and they were selling this ice melt, and my wife's like, "Yeah, okay, I'll support it." And I, didn't really look at the bag, and it was salt. And essentially, what happened is when I went to shovel, and I threw this, salt from the sidewalk onto the grass, it killed my grass. Like my grass was completely dead in about a foot strip on either side of the sidewalk. Now, why was that? Well, essentially, what happened is when it rained in the springtime and when the snow melted in the springtime, I basically had like ocean water, like salt water, like really concentrated salt water that was basically watering the plants on either side of my sidewalk. Well, what was the problem with that? Isn't water water? Well, no, that water was extremely hypertonic, right? So instead of the water traveling into my grass, what happened? Remember, guys, the golden rule: water moves from hypo to hyper. So essentially, I watered my lawn with salt water, and water moved out of the grass and basically burnt the grass, killed the grass, right? So we have to be really careful that we're not watering our plants with hypertonic solutions, because instead of the water moving into the plant, it will actually move out of the plant. And a little sneak peek into Bio 20 when we talk about the kidneys and water balance. You've probably heard you're not supposed to, if you were, we're landlocked in Alberta. But let's say in the future you find yourself stranded on a deserted island. Should you drink ocean water? No. And it's the same kind of idea about watering my grass with salt water. What's going to happen is the water in your belly is going to end up in your blood. Your blood is going to become extremely hypertonic, and water will actually move out of your tissues. So you'll become dehydrated, just like my grass was dehydrated. Okay? Now, if plants shrink and become flaccid, the cytoplasm shrinks away from the cell wall, and the cell essentially shrinks, and we get this wilting. That's known as plasmolysis. Okay, the cytoplasm shrinking away from the cell wall is known as plasmolysis. Now, if we put our plants in a more hypotonic environment, then water will move into the plant. And the plant will become more turgid. The cells will swell as the vacuole becomes filled with water, and the plants will not be wilty. So that's a trick for you. If you're looking for a healthy snack and you look in the fridge and maybe the celery's been in there for a little while and you're like, "Oh, gross! I'm not eating that. It's wilty, gross celery." Just cut it up and put it in some fresh cold water for a little while, and that water will move into the cells through osmosis, and it will become crisp again in no time. So here's our celery. Celery is used in a lot of these demonstrations because it's simple, it's cheap, and when exposed to water, it will absorb and get rid of this water really quickly. So both of these appear to be in water. How come the one on the left is so wilty, and how come the one on the right is nice and turgid? Well, this is salt solution, right? So this water here is hypertonic. So the water is actually moving out of the celery, right? Whereas this is distilled water. This is pure water. This water here is hypotonic when compared to the cytoplasm of the celery cells. So water is actually going to move into the celery and fill the cells with water. All right, so short and sweet today. Again, transpiration, pull, and root pressure. Hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic came into play again today. Active transport, passive transport. So all the stuff that we have talked about in the past came into play today. So as usual, there are some questions on page 42 of your note package. Please take a look at those. That's it for today.